Path of Exile's Mirage League is launching in about a week, and one of the new things they're introducing is a bunch of new holy skills, and they've also reworked some of the existing holy skills and buffed them, things like Holy Flame Totem, for example. And one of the skills they're actually reworking in quite a big way is Sweep. So Sweep is one of the oldest skills in the game. It's an attack skill, and notably, it's not a strike or a slam, it's just a basic attack. And this was kind of a really old and clunky skill. It would knock back enemies. It wasn't very good. And Holy Sweep is the new version of Sweep. So you can see the skill in action here. The character kind of swings their weapon around. It hits a 360 around the character in quite a big area. And then upon hitting enemies, some of those enemies that are struck will drop a hammer down in a smaller area. And that hammer can hit enemies that are in that area, and obviously that damage can overlap. So that's the kind of extra potential of the skill that's being added in with this new mechanic. Now in this video I wanted to go over this skill because I think there's actually quite a lot of really good tech that you can use with it to make this skill a lot better than it first seems. So Holy Sweep is a 440% base damage attack, and it has 70% base attack speed. So that means that the initial hit is going to hit for 440%, and then the hammer that falls down from hitting that target is going to deal that same damage less 35%, which is 286%, and that brings the damage to a total of 726%, but then you have the 70% base attack speed, which means that this is a 508% weapon damage per second ability when it's being used on a single target, which isn't that great, but it's also not the worst. However, the notable thing about Sweep is the extra mechanic of the hammer kind of falling down and hitting an area means that you can abuse it with different mechanics in the game that allow you to create extra targets and some other stuff, which we're going to get into in this video. So, one thing that I want to note immediately about Holy Sweep is that area of effect scaling is potentially going to not only improve your coverage, so the amount of clearing you can do with a single attack, but it's also going to scale your single target damage if you can increase the area of the hammers enough so that multiple hits would overlap. So we'll get into that a little bit more later on, but first of all, let's talk about introducing extra targets to this attack. So first there's the Writhing Jar there, which is a flask. It's a life flask. This one's used most commonly with the Slayer, for example, during a boss encounter. Whenever there's kind of phases where the boss isn't doing anything and you can't actually hit the boss, you usually use this. You'll just pop out this flask. It will spawn 2 enemy worms, which can then be hit. And then in regards to the Slayer there, you'll be able to, keep your fortification up. You'll be able to keep your leech up. And that's quite a useful flask. However, in the case of Holy Sweep, you'll be able to use this flask to spawn 2 worms. And those worms can then be hit to create extra hammers, which will also hit the single target that you're standing on top of. So this is basically a way to create extra targets to then cause extra damage from the single hit. So assuming you're able to hit both worms and both of the hammers overlap, along with your main attack which also hits the hammer, that's going to be that base 726% damage with an extra 572% coming from the extra 2 hammers for a total of 1298% weapon damage when you're getting those 2 extra overlaps on the hammers. So that's pretty good. Obviously, you need to actually add this into your build with a way to generate lots of flask charges and things like that, but that is definitely something to think about with this skill. And then we have Squirming Terror, which is basically like a mini version of the Writhing Jar. It spawns 1 worm every 2 seconds automatically, and there's also the added benefit there of it having a chance to trigger socketed spells on kill, which is something you're going to be doing all the time. Whenever you actually hit a worm, that's a guaranteed kill. So you may be able to make use of that ring if you want to. I don't think this is really that good, but I wanted to mention it anyway as a way to actually generate extra targets for those extra hammers. Now, something that a lot of people will bring up is the Hateful Accuser, which is a ritual exclusive ring. This was often used with RF for those explosion ignites, but this one has the Penance Mark skill. Now, Penance Mark is actually a curse. This will replace your curse skill, so you'll have to kind of make note of that by using this, you are using a curse. But it's a mark skill, and it scales up with mark effects and curse effects. By default, it will summon 3 phantasms around the target whenever you hit the target, no more than once per second. So essentially, once every second, you can spawn 3 extra targets. This sounds very good on paper, but the problem is that these phantasms actually spawn quite a large distance away from the target, and you'll actually be able to see there in the footage of some testing that I was doing that the distance is quite far away. Now, in some ways you can manipulate this in terms of, where you're standing once you're actually using the skill to spawn the minions, and there's also the chance there that you're in an area that's fairly closed off, in which case the phantasms will actually be spawning closer to the target because they have nowhere else to go. But do keep in mind that the Holy Sweep skill there, the base hammer impact radius is only 1.2 meters. Now, I actually have the area effect here that I can show you. So this is the base hammer radius. So this is not the sweep radius, this is the hammer radius, and this is the base radius. So you'll be able to scale this up a little bit, but starting at 1.2 is quite small, and it's going to be quite hard to scale this up to have a large enough area effect to actually take advantage of Penance Mark in a really good way. So do note that Penance Mark, whilst it may work in some areas, I think it's going to be one of the weaker options in terms of, the Writhing Jar and other ways to actually get those extra hits. But I wanted to mention it there anyway. Now, one of the other ways to guarantee extra hits is going to be Hydrosphere. Now, Hydrosphere is actually just a really good skill in terms of Holy Sweep. I think that every build that's using Holy Sweep will be using this setup because this is basically a guaranteed extra hit every time you actually use the skill. And the way our Hydrosphere works is it's just basically this extra target that spawns. It also has some extra things going on there, like it will have a drenched debuff on enemies, which conveniently applies lightning exposure, which is kind of nice because that means that it might free up your glove implicits, for example. You'll be able to get your lightning exposure from this rather than from your gloves or from elsewhere. But this is going to create a Hydrosphere on the ground, and then you'll be able to hit it no more than once every second, because it has a internal cooldown. And every time you hit this, there's going to be an extra hammer falling on top of the Hydrosphere. And because this is something that you can just spawn directly on the boss, it will always create an extra hammer hit on the target. And this means that if you factor in Hydrosphere, you will always get 1012% weapon damage per hit of Holy Sweep. So that's now actually ending up being quite a lot of damage. You've gone from 726% with the base hit up to 1012% with that extra hammerful with the Hydrosphere. But there is one really cool thing you can actually do with Hydrosphere. And, for example, if you don't want to self-cast it, you can link it to Battle Mage's Cry, which is a war cry that then exerts the attack, and exerts 5 attacks that you perform, and it will trigger a socketed spell on their first melee hit. So this is not actually when you use the skill, but it's when the attack actually hits, it will then summon the Hydrosphere. Now, this is really important because you can actually get round the downside of Hydrosphere with this 1 second cooldown by using 2 Hydrospheres socketed in Battle Mage's Cry. This will mean that every time you actually hit with Battle Mage's Cry, it will alternate between the 2 Hydrospheres, and instead of repositioning the Hydrosphere, it will resummon it. Because it's an orb skill, you can only have one of them, so it will resummon the Hydrosphere and replace the old one. That will refresh the internal cooldown. And because it happens when you actually hit the target, that means that the attack can hit the current Hydrosphere, and then it can immediately hit the new Hydrosphere with the same attack, right? Because it's this 360 sweep that just goes around, and it's got like a sort of conal area that's going to be hitting monsters. And so there's going to be an immediate hammer coming down from the current Hydrosphere, then there's going to be a secondary one, and you're going to get a lot of extra damage by doing that way. And in terms of the exerts, depending on your attack speed scaling and things like that, you may find that 5 attacks is not enough. You can, of course, go for extra exerts. There's the Impact Force Propagator there, which is a 2-handed mace, conveniently, because you're going to have to use a 2-handed mace or a staff for this attack, since you can no longer use an axe or a sword. So that is something you can do there for some extra exerts. There is, of course, the Berserker Ascendancy for double exerts there on the Warbringer node, and you even have things like the Measured Fury notable there on the tree as well. So you can scale that up to make sure that you always have that exert coming in from Battle Mage's Cry. Now, aside from the whole creating extra targets to hit for the extra hammerfalls, something that I want to talk about in terms of Holy Sweep is the best use case for this skill, because this skill, if you just look at it on paper, with a 70% base attack speed, it's not that great of a skill overall if you don't use the kind of extra mechanics to create the extra hits. But one thing that I think is going to be really strong with Holy Sweep is General's Cry. So General's Cry spawns a bunch of Mirages. It's 5 baseline, you get an extra 1 from quality. So 6 Mirages on a level 20 gem with 20% quality. And each of these Mirages will then go out and use their attack once before they disappear. The crucial thing about this is by using General's Cry, you basically get to ignore the downside of having such slow attack speed, because you're now only limited by your Warcry speed and your Warcry cooldown, assuming your Mirages can make the attack before the next ones replace them. But in regards to that, there was actually a pretty important patch note that came in at the end of last league, which I think a lot of players would have missed because it's something that happened, towards the middle or the end of the last league. And it's this change right here, which is General's Cry spawned clones are now not yet considered to be active, and thus counting against your maximum allowed. So this means that when they actually first get spawned, and you kind of see them being created, they are not considered to be active until they start moving towards the target and then start performing their attack, right? Previously, what would actually happen with this, and it says it right here, is that as soon as you use the General's Cry, it would basically immediately delete the current ones, even if they hadn't finished attacking. And this buys you a bit of extra time because you have a bit more time there to actually execute the attacks for the Mirages. And that's going to make these builds, especially the ones with the slow attack speeds, feel a bit better when it comes to actually getting those attacks off for the Mirages. That means you may be able to use Mirage, which conveniently in this patch actually got a big area of effect buff. This now has another modifier on it, which is I think 40 to 50% increased area of effect. So that is something you could look at. You would never want to use this mace in a build with yourself just attacking because it's going to be ridiculously slow. But when it comes to General's Cry, it might be something you want to look at. Now, the last thing I want to discuss in this video is area of effect scaling, because as I was talking about there at the start of the video, by scaling area of effect, you can not only get better clearing, but you can also potentially get better single target damage if you can overlap those hammers when it comes to things like Writhing Worms and Penance Mark. So in terms of area of effect scaling, there's going to be a few good candidates for this. One is the Juggernaut with Endurance Charge stacking. You get a bunch of area effects here from Unyielding. You also get a bit more down here on one of these small nodes. This is another 3% per Endurance Charge. And then of course, because this skill needs to use a two-handed mace or a staff, you could use the Eventuality Rod, which is an extra Endurance Charge on the implicit. So that's a bit of potential there. And one of the other things I want to mention there in terms of Ascendancy choices with regards to scaling area of effect is the potential for either a champion or a slayer to take the gladiator's weapon master using Forbidden Flesh and Flame Jewels, because Holy Sweep requires you to use a two-handed mace or a staff, and Weapon Master has 20% more area of effect while wielding a mace or a scepter, but the rest of the Ascendancy doesn't really lend itself well at all to using a two-handed mace. There's not really very good things going on here. So making use of either of these Ascendancies is going to be better, I think, in that regard, and then you can obviously take that and make use of the more area effect. And other than that, the other notable skill there would be Blood and Sand, because Blood and Sand has the more area effects component when you're in Sand Stance, which again is another pretty big scaler when it comes to area effects, because more area effect modifiers are very rare and hard to come by. But that's going to be it for this video. I just wanted to cover Holy Sweep because I think it does have some interesting mechanics, and there's going to be some things that you can do, some shenanigans that you can do in terms of getting a lot of extra hits there. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.